is our lecture on perspective. Okay, so perspective is probably something that you will be using in your final project in some way. So I'm going to give you a few kind of tools and strategies and the best ways and some simple ways as well to use perspective. So perspective, you guys have probably done in some of your drawings so far, but it's just creating a depth in your drawing or creating three-dimensional space within your drawing. So we kind of talked about this a little bit when we were talking about shape versus form, so it's definitely related to that. So I'll give you some ways to do that. So there are these are the four main types of perspective out there. Some are easier, some are more difficult, and some you've probably already used before. And some you may not. Let's start with linear. Actually, I should put that one first, but we'll start with linear perspective. That just means using lines to create perspective. So if you've drawn this little cube before, that is using lines to create the illusion of a 3D space. So all of our art is on a two-dimensional space, meaning in our sketchbook or our computer screen is flat. So it's kind of using these illusions or tricks to make things feel like they're three-dimensional, okay? So we could have a whole semester, a whole class just on linear perspective. So I'm just going to very briefly go over it. You probably won't use it much. Not everyone will use it. I've seen it used a few times in a couple people's projects. So I'll just give a very, very quick overview if you end up using this to kind of the main things to think about when you're doing that. So it's all based around a eye level or horizon line. This is your eye level. It's also called a horizon line. And it's basically the idea that all parallel lines will converge to a single point. So that single point is a vanishing point. Okay, vanishing point. So it's basically saying you have to know, so since this is our eye level right here, you have to know if you're looking up on something or looking down on something. So if we put a box up here, you're going to be looking up at this box, right? And if you put a box down here below your eye level, it will be below your eye level, so you're looking at the top of that. So the way you figure this out is all these sides of this box will converge to that vanishing point. Same with this one. So this kind of allows you to make these cubes exist realistically in the same space. So you see this type of drawing if you're drawing anything with straight edges. So if you're drawing buildings, roads, city streets, houses, anything like that, you will see. So now those cubes exist in the same space. So if you have one right here at your eye level, you're not going to see the top or the bottom. You will only see the side of that, and then you kind of just cut it off and decide how long you want this to be. But the biggest thing is to think about, are you looking up or are you looking down on an object? And I'll use this same strategy, you know, if I'm drawing a roadway or a city. So there's a city street that converges to there. And we can put some buildings in along that roadway. Let's come to that vanishing point. You don't need to be super accurate with these. Depends on your style. If you're someone who has a very cleaned up, neat, perfect style, then you'll maybe want to use a ruler to get these perspective lines. I prefer to keep them a little loose. So now all these buildings can exist in a real three-dimensional space. You know, once you get used to it too, I just start to kind of eyeball it as well. So there's also 2-point and 3-point perspective, which gets very complicated, and we won't get into that today, but just know that it kind of exists. So if you ever are curious more about perspective or things like that, there's a lot more information that we could do with this. So then we can, you know, put our cars down here that look like cars that I'm drawing. Buses. Okay. So that's linear perspective. All right, so Again, you may not end up using linear perspective, but that's fine. I just wanted to introduce it. So let's introduce a common one here that you will use. Atmospheric perspective. So you will probably use this in one form or another. You may have already done this. That's just the idea that, well, you see it a lot in color illustrations. So if you've ever been to the beach and looked at hills going off into the distance, or been looking at mountains that go off into the distance, things like that, that's where you may have seen atmospheric perspective, and it's based on the idea that literally the light coming from these hills, as they go through the atmosphere, our air, those lines become more faded, or the light becomes more faded. Things get lighter and lighter as they go further away. So it's a lot easier to illustrate. So as you can see here, I kind of did a little like beach type sketch thing. Let's see here. I don't know if there's water going the other way. There we go. There we go. So these are supposed to be hills that go off into the distance right there. So let's drop some value in here. So basically the idea here is everything will get lighter and closer to the value of the sky. So I'll make these just a little bit darker there. Okay. I go through select everything except that far away one. And I'm drawing in Photoshop here, so this process will be a little bit different if you're as we work in Illustrator and whatnot. Okay, so now hopefully feels like things are going off into the distance. Those hills get lighter and lighter and should kind of feel like they are fading away the further you go. Okay, this is related to line weight also, where I will put a very thin line. Maybe I don't even need a line around that one off there. I'll put a very thin line here, and thicker lines the more forward I come into the foreground. Okay, I've seen this in some of your guys' drawings, but it's good to note how that works. Let's do another quick version here. Oops. So this is the same idea, except we will use these buildings. I think I used this on another example we did. I forget exactly which one it was. But we're going to, oh, I did this on the line weight. So we'll use line weight, and that's kind of like showing that atmospheric perspective using line weight. Okay, so we got thick line in the foreground, medium in the middle ground, thin line in the distance. We put a cloud here with a really thin line way far away. So this is kind of a version of atmospheric perspective. The lines should feel like they're fading away the further away they go. So remember to vary that line weight in your drawings. So now let's think about details / texture. Okay, so I do want to see texture somewhere in your final art. So where do you put texture and details, okay? So I want a lot of details and texture on that cloud. I want a lot of details and texture on that building off in the distance. No. I want the most detail and the most texture here in the foreground. So let's think of some details and texture. We'll put some windows down here. Okay, some patterns in the architecture, details in the architecture, but texture is what is really good. So texture will make things feel closer to you because you literally can't see or can't tell the texture of things that are far away. So I'm going to put in some brick texture, some cracked concrete, maybe some sludge, some dirt here on this building. It's all, you know, making it more visually interesting. We talk about texture and small details as part of storytelling. But it's also related to that perspective, okay? So most texture, most details here in the foreground. Middle ground here, this building. To make it feel kind of far away, I will put some details. So I'll just suggest some window shapes here. I'm not going to get into putting texture of the building. We'll just suggest these details. And then once we get into this building here in the background, maybe we could put a few lines. I don't even think it needs it. Let's just leave that as a shape. So it's nice sometimes things far away you can leave as just shapes. You don't need to put details and texture on it. If I put details and texture everywhere in this drawing, like I was putting lines here, I was putting like shadows and details here, if I was drawing texture, this building, it would start to get too busy, right? So limit where you put those textures and details and use that to help show perspective in your drawing. So think about as you're working on your workup sketches and your thumbnails, where are you going to put texture in your drawings? I want to see texture somewhere in that final art. So some people have done really cool like stylized texture where you kind of use the pattern presets from Adobe Illustrator, which can be very cool. So you don't have to make it like realistic texture. It can be kind of stylized texture using pattern. I just tend to do kind of the more realistic style, but I really like seeing kind of that pattern texture as well, especially since I don't use it as much and I don't think I'm quite as good as that as I am at the more realistic style. So find kind of what you've done already and see what you can make work in your final art. Okay, so you see here I then combine value with the atmospheric. So line weight shows perspective, amount of details and texture shows the perspective, and so does the value. So you kind of have a combination as you work on these different things. All right, what's next? Overlap. Very simple. Seemingly simple. It's basically saying being able to tell what's in front and what is behind is going to be very helpful in your art. So just looking at this example, what's in front? The rectangle or the circle? Right now we can't really tell. So all you have to do is make them overlap. Now I can clearly see that rectangle is in front of circle. Let's go back to our city example and do a very bad version of this. Okay, we got building there, building 1, building 2, building 3, cloud, sun, other cloud. So right now I can't tell what's in front and what's behind any of these shapes. It's very kind of confusing and visually jarring, and there's not a good sense of overlap in here. So to redesign this, all you have to do is slide your things around. If you've already made these shapes in Illustrator, sometimes it's helpful because you can move shapes around in Illustrator after, but you want to start thinking about these overlaps and things like that. All the way back to your thumbnails. Okay, and we'll overlap the sun shape there. Put a cloud back here. Clouds are behind the buildings. Cloud is also in front of the sun. Okay? So just pushing those overlaps, and especially like on things that will really help. You won't always have good overlaps, but just making sure overlaps make sense and you don't have something like this here where there's no overlaps and it kind of creates that confusing image for the viewer. All right, last one, diminishing. I am diminishing size. Again, seemingly simple. Just the idea that when you see something that is bigger, it is closer to us, and if something smaller, it's further away. Okay, so things further away seem smaller. So anytime you can repeat a shape to help you with that, that is going to be very helpful. So I will intentionally try and have shapes repeat in my drawings to show that they're getting smaller the further away they go. So typical one I use a lot is a lamppost type shape. like a lamppost, kind of. So I want to make that get smaller, so I'll just come here, draw another one that's a little bit smaller. Maybe one way back here. It's that same shape getting smaller and smaller. So pretty simple idea here. So now we have those lampposts going off into the distance. But we got it somewhere else here. So we got the path is wider right here, and it's thinner back here, and even thinner there in the distance. Okay, so that helps show it there. If I want to put some shapes like buildings back here in the distance, I don't need to put details on these buildings. So that's what's nice about drawing things off in the distance. I don't need to come in and worry about drawing texture and all these windows. I can put a few things in there just to suggest that there's windows on here, but I don't need to spend a lot of time on the texture and details on something when it's far away. Here in the foreground, now I can put some more texture here. I can put some grass texture so we know it's grass. Even put some like cracks and texture on the sidewalk here. But back here, I don't really need to do anything else. Okay. So just showing that that thing gets smaller and smaller. You know, putting a person in there too is something that's used a lot, and I can put smaller people back there. Okay, so look in your drawing as you're working on thumbnails and workup sketches, and see what can be used to make smaller as it goes off into the distance. All right, let's look at some professional examples of perspective. Or actually, here's some atmospheric perspective. This is a photograph, so I challenge you next time you're out somewhere where you can see off into the distance, compare the color of the tree in the foreground or of a color of a tree closer to you versus something that's further away. You'll see the color fades and is lighter, and oftentimes it will get a little bit bluer the further away it goes. Here's an example. You really see it on like foggy and cloudy days. Things become grayer and grayer. So these trees here that are closer to us, you can see the difference between tree and snow. You can see texture on the branches. By the time we're back here, these are just silhouette shapes. Okay? And it kind of fades out as you go off into the distance. And it's now you got your telephone poles here getting smaller and smaller as well. So you usually have a combination of different types of perspectives, some linear and atmospheric, whatever it may be. Now here's an illustrative version of perspective, so you can see the trees are darkest here in the foreground, most details and texture here in the foreground, and then these trees further away kind of fade away into the mist. This is a very cool example there. Here's a simple sketch version of it. Very, very simple. Not a lot of depth, but just can kind of one shape closer here, the darker shape closer, and the lighter shape here further away. So this was done with hatching and pin to build up those lighter and darker values. Here's a comic book version. Again, texture and pattern here in the foreground, details here on the foreground, but I like these buildings in the background. They're just silhouette shapes. Okay, so again, too many details on these buildings back here would overcomplicate and busy up the image too much. Here's another photographic example. So you see texture, details in the foreground, and obviously Seattle's obviously cloudy lots of times, so you can see these not as many details. You can see a little bit of detail here in these buildings, but they're basically just silhouette shapes there, and they're all lighter values. So darker values in the bushes, darker values in the shadows, darker values on the clothes, on the hair. But you don't really see any solid black value here amongst the skyline. Okay, again, buildings fading away in the distance. All these dark values here in the foreground. So really dark values in foreground, the lighter the further away you go is going to be a really good way to show that. Here we got repetition of shape, these kind of cool sci-fi flying ships. and they just get smaller and smaller. So big one in the foreground, medium, medium, small off there in the distance, and you're getting lighter values on it. So again, combination of diminishing size as well as lighter values. So almost all drawings have some sort of perspective in them. Darker trees in the foreground. All these shapes back here are lighter. Okay. So just remember, I do want to see texture somewhere in your drawings on the final project. Be thinking about that as you start thumbnails and workup sketches, and see where you can work that texture into there. You don't need to have like one of these types of perspective, but if you are using atmospheric perspective, I've seen some people like make the clouds really dark or the sun really dark. Usually those things are further away, so you want to make them lighter. But all these rules can also change depending on like the mood you're illustrating and things like that. So I just want to give you just some kind of tools and strategies for how to draw depth in your final projects.